on. This is the last time you're going through it. We got to play a 60-minute game together. Call it up. Let's bring it.
It's hard to argue that there's been a consistently better basketball program in both men's and women's sports over the last 25 years than the UConn Huskies. Since 1999, the Huskies have won more men's and women's basketball championships than any other team, with 6 for the men, beating out UNC and Duke with 3, and Kansas, Villanova, and Florida with 2, and a whopping 10 for the women, with the only teams really coming close being Baylor and South Carolina with 3 each in that same time frame. Simply put, the Huskies aren't just a new blood. They're a blue blood through and through. What makes this even more impressive is the fact that, for the most part, they've achieved this dominance in the only power conference that doesn't sponsor football, the Big East. But recently, there have been rumblings of UConn taking back their place in the power conferences by ditching their home in the Big East for another basketball power, the Big 12 Conference. But with a national resume like UConn's, with excellent facilities and name brand recognition across the country, a question comes to arise. Why isn't UConn already in a power conference, especially now with the collapse of the Pac-12? What's their history as a football school, knowing that football drives the realignment bus, and why aren't they in the ACC, Big 12, or even Big 10 already? How did UConn get to be lost out in the cold as the NCAA's stray dog? Let's start from the beginning, or at least the beginning of where everything makes sense. You see, UConn is actually one of the younger football teams at the FBS level. Up until the 2000 season, the Huskies were a member of Division I AA, later known as the FCS, which was designated for often smaller schools who had more skin in the game in other sports than football, or just simply didn't make the money to compete at higher levels. They didn't have much of a history as a football program up until 1998 either. You see, going into 1998, the Huskies only had 6 seasons of 8 wins or more in their entire history, going back to their inception as a program in 1896. 1998 would actually be their best football season in history, as the team went 10-3 as a member of the Atlantic 10 Conference and made their first ever trip to the FCS playoffs, where they won their first game against Hampton and then lost to Georgia Southern in the second round. All time as a program from 1896 to 1999, the Huskies had a win percentage of just over 48%. When they first made the journey to big-time college sports with their induction into the Big East as a member for all sports except football in 1979, their basketball program was already historically a tournament regular, so they appeared ready to make the jump. But football, as was the case with so many other New England schools, save for Boston College, was lagging behind in the facilities department, playing in the 16,000-capacity Memorial Stadium. It was bad enough that members of the Husky staff were against the money necessary to upgrade the Huskies enough to join the highest level of competition, according to a 1994 article from the New York Times. It was voted down time after time, but university leadership still thought it was a good move. But 1998 was used as a springboard to get the Huskies finally over the hump and into the next highest level of college sports competition. And in 2000, they finally completed their transition process from the Atlantic 10 of Division I AA to 1A independent under Randy Edsall. Still members of the Big East in all but football, the Huskies actually hit the ground running with the big boys. After 2 straight sub-500 seasons in 2000 and 2001, the Huskies managed to break even in 2002 and explode onto the scene in 2003, all in time to join the rest of their conference compatriots in the Big East's football conference in 2004. This was largely done in a brand new football stadium opened in 2003, Rentschler Field, a 40,000-capacity stadium built specifically for the Huskies. The Big East had sponsored a football conference since 1991, almost separate from the basketball branch. Until then, the conference had featured mostly Catholic and non-football playing schools from New England, but after 1991 had added the Miami Hurricanes, which were in the middle of becoming a dominant football power as a full member, as well as easing Northeastern football independents like Virginia Tech and West Virginia into the conference to join existing Big East members like Pitt and Syracuse. This famously led to some discord between the football-playing and non-football playing members of the conference, which would eventually be the downfall of the Big East Football Conference as a whole. But UConn was one of the rare schools straddling both lines as a basketball power only growing in strength and a football team that consistently punched above its weight. The Huskies went 8-4 in 2004, their first season as a full member of the Big East, and just a few years later in 2007 tied for the conference's football title after West Virginia lost to Pitt. They'd win 8 games each the next 3 seasons, again tying for the number 1 spot in the conference in 2010 and losing to Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl before Randy Edsall left the program to become the head coach at Maryland in 2011. New head coach Paul Pasqualoni struggled with the Huskies, leading them to 5-7 for the last 2 years of the Big East's existence, before the conference officially collapsed after too many of its football members left for other conferences, and the football-playing members morphed the remains of the conference into an American Athletic Conference, a completely different conference than the Big East, which gave up on the gridiron but still kept its name and branding for all sports except football. UConn had a choice to make. Either stay with the Big East, which they'd been a member of since 1979 and had formed big-time basketball rivalries with schools in, or chase the money and a spot at a Power 5 conference by sticking with the new conference for all sports. They chose the American. Now, this wasn't without some controversy. For starters, there was a lot of smoke around UConn joining the ACC as a full member once it came out that the conference was recruiting Big East members. UConn had to watch as Big East member after Big East member was selected for a spot in the ACC. Miami and Virginia Tech left in 2004, Boston College left in 2005, Syracuse and Pitt did in 2013. But as it turns out, the ACC didn't favor Pitt in that last round of additions. They really wanted UConn, and Pitt was slated to form a new eastern branch of the Big 12 with West Virginia and Louisville, according to ESPN writer Andrea Adelson. But Boston College, who had already left the Huskies behind in 2005, wanted to slam the door shut behind them. Boston College was still mad over comments UConn made about them when they left in 2005 and wanted to be the only ACC team in New England. UConn wasn't alone. They filed a lawsuit against the Eagles alongside Pitt way back then. But the Eagles were insistent and blocked the ACC from pursuing UConn, so the conference pivoted and added the Panthers instead. Feelings were still sour a few years later when Maryland left the ACC and the conference added Louisville instead of UConn, still right there, waiting for their Power 5 gig. Even now, with Florida State and Clemson all but screaming that they're intending on leaving the conference, the ACC doesn't seem all that interested in adding UConn, over 10 years and more national basketball titles later. If you want to add more salt to the Huskies' wounds, you could mention the fact that UConn also made the shortlist for Big Ten conference expansion in the early 2010s as an alternative to Rutgers. According to Joe Nocera of the New York Times, UConn was considered right alongside Pitt, Missouri, and the conference's White Whale and Notre Dame, but eventually it was decided that Rutgers' AAU status and proximity to New York City outweighed the prospect of contesting the ACC for New England, and the Huskies didn't make it too far down that road either. Making it worse for everyone was that UConn, as an athletic department, completely collapsed during their time in the American Athletic Conference. From 2013 to 2019, the football program only managed to win 6 games once in 2015, where they lost the St. Petersburg Bowl against Marshall. Every other season, they failed to win more than 3 games. Recruiting became impossible when they were playing more teams in Texas than in the Northeast. Why play at UConn when you could play at Syracuse or Rutgers in the Power 5? And while women's basketball was a dynasty, men's basketball struggled. Despite winning the national championship in 2014 under Kevin Ollie, the program steadily declined and faced recruiting violations so bad they fired Ollie. Dan Hurley was hired in 2018 to help rebuild the program, and it took him until 2022 to put another team on the court that was good enough to win a national championship. He's won the last 2, but not as a member of the American, since the Huskies officially left the American and joined the Big East for all sports in 2020. Football got left as an independent, the sport that nobody in stores cares about. Since the collapse of the Big East Football Conference, UConn football, as a member of the American and as an independent, is 30-92. There was some hope that new head coach Jim Mora would be able to help spark a new rise in the Huskies program after a 6-7 season with a bowl loss in 2022, but he regressed to the mean in 2023 with a 3-9 season. Part of this is UConn's location. It is genuinely hard to recruit football players in the Northeast, which is a region dominated by basketball and hockey, and if you're any good as a recruit, there's a significant chance you're going to get found and sent off to Penn State or Ohio State or Clemson. On top of that, Northeastern fans tend to support those basketball and hockey teams way more. Remember Rentschler Field, UConn's Power 5 level stadium? Well, it's mostly empty these days on game day, not just because the Huskies are bad, but because it's nearly 25 miles and a 30-minute drive away from UConn's campus. UConn is in Storrs, Connecticut. Rentschler Field is located in Hartford, and it hasn't gotten any meaningful upgrades since it was built. So UConn football didn't just miss the boat. It got kicked, tripped at the finish line, and the rest of the race finished around them. It doesn't matter that they're basically a Power 5 school in everything except for football success. They missed their shot at the Power 4 already and just decided to give up. They'd never have another shot at the Promised Land. unless. Meet Brett Yormark, the commissioner of the Big 12 Conference and one of the most important players in this UConn saga. For starters, Yormark is a Northeastern guy molded by spectacle. He was born in New Jersey, and his resume includes stops in media businesses in New York City and a stint as the CEO of the New Jersey/Brooklyn Nets. He knows there's no bigger basketball brand in the Northeast, his home, than the UConn Huskies. And it's pretty clear with his rap sheet with the Big 12 Conference, of which he's been commissioner for the last few years, that he's chasing basketball dominance. The Big 12 already has a handful of basketball powerhouses. Kansas has been in the conference since its inception, with other talented schools like Baylor and Texas Tech having made national championships recently. Even the old Big 12 schools, like Kansas State and Oklahoma State, have long underrated histories at the top of the basketball world. You add that to schools like Arizona, Cincinnati, and Houston, who all joined under Yormark's tenure as commissioner and are considered some of the better brands in college basketball, and the Big 12, at least on paper, looks like college basketball's most dominant conference. And Yormark hasn't been shy about shoring up that side of the sporting world even more, with not-so-secret conversations between the Big 12 Conference and schools like Gonzaga and, yes, UConn being reported on over the last few years. You see, it's been theorized that the Big Ten and SEC, two talented basketball conferences but football juggernauts, will soon attempt to split from the NCAA as we know it and form their own league. No longer would a chunk of college sports be able to compete for college football crowns. It's those two schools and nobody else. There's already this fear with the college football playoff, with some loudly fearing that the playoff will eventually feature up to 8 Big Ten and SEC teams every year over equally deserving Big 12 or ACC schools, not just a group of 5 schools who've never gotten a fair shot. On the same side of this coin is Brett Yormark in the Big 12, who, in shoring up their basketball members, seem like they're building the Big 12 into being a conference that's too talented to be left out of the top level of college sports entirely. After all, how are you supposed to crown an elite basketball champion if you're not allowing Kansas, Arizona, or Iowa State to even play for it? So there's some thought that Yormark is trying to turn the Big 12 from a college sports conference into a miniature college sports league so good at basketball that it can't be left out of that top tier. That's why so many are keeping an eye on the ACC, with the possibility the Big 12 swoops in and takes football underachievers like Duke or NC State and rivals of existing members like Louisville and Pitt. And with the possibility of Eastern members joining the league, the greatest college basketball brand sits right there for the taking. Simply put, Brett Yormark wants UConn bad. The rest of the Big 12 is on the fence. It's this realignment that brings another sphere of possibility, considering the fact that Florida State and Clemson, two of the strongest teams in the ACC, want out, most likely to join some of their cross-conference rivals in the Southern-dominated SEC. In doing so, they would likely destabilize the conference even further, leaving a few more ACC teams available to be swiped up by them, the Big 10, or Big 12. If the resulting exodus isn't as strong, there's a big possibility the ACC will look to schools like Memphis, South Florida, and, yes, UConn to fill in the gap left behind. If I had to make a prediction on where UConn will be rehomed, or if it would even happen, I'd have to point back to the last time Yormark really wanted to add a basketball school in Gonzaga. This was at the peak of the Pac-12's instability, and with Gonzaga also on the West Coast, it seems from the outside that he was using the Bulldogs as a pawn in order to make those 3 schools who were late to jump to the Big 12 more desperate. That's what I think Yormark is doing with UConn, only this time to ACC schools instead. By having those talks with UConn and even bringing them to a vote of official Big 12 heads, not only is Brett able to consider the team he wants to add to the conference, but he also provides additional pressure to members of the ACC who think they'll probably not be picked up by the Big 10 or SEC if enough members of the ACC leave. Remember, Colorado was the first team to jump ship from the Pac-12, putting pressure on the rest of the conference to move. It might be that the first team to leave the ACC goes to the Big 12 before Clemson or Florida State can move to their desired conference, with my prediction centering around either Louisville or Pittsburgh. Neither of those 2 schools have the current basketball pedigree that UConn has, but are known to have strong basketball histories in general. But one last factor hasn't been addressed here: the Big East. The Huskies love the Big East. University heads love it because they're easily the biggest profile school there, fans love it because all their rivals are there, and players love it because it's somewhat regional, with the furthest member from the Huskies being Creighton in Nebraska. Joining the Big 12 would mean their closest fellow conference member would be West Virginia, an 8-hour drive away. Their next closest member would be Cincinnati, over 12 hours away. Yes, both of these schools were former conference mates in the Big East, and they share history, but that doesn't offset potential in-conference games in Texas, Kansas, and now Arizona and Utah. While that pill's a little easier to swallow for basketball, imagine sending football players, track runners, or even volleyball players on an overnight trip to Colorado for a game in the middle of November, only for them to have a test in class the next morning. Like, I get that the line between student and athlete is getting further away every year, but for a lot of these athletes, they are still here to play school somewhat. The only way I would support UConn joining the conference is if they're a member of a massive Eastern branch. Bring in UConn if you're also bringing Louisville or Pitt or Virginia Tech or Miami, but I think it's more likely that UConn elects to stay in the Big East. All their rivals are there, and it's not like the smaller conference is hurting them in their success, either monetarily or on the basketball court. But in terms of getting left behind in the shift of college sports, the Big 12 is easily the best option for them if the ACC doesn't look their way. Not only is it a talented basketball conference, but it provides a boost to their football program too. Remember that UConn's football got significantly better during their time in the Big East. It's entirely possible that if they get the support from joining a power conference and New England throws their support behind them, we could be looking at a genuinely competitive football team, just like we did in 2010. But here's where I'll kick it to you. What do you think will happen to UConn? Will they throw away old rivalries in the Big East to create new ones with KU or Arizona? Or will they finally be able to convince Boston College to let them into the ACC? Or, just like Gonzaga, are they just a pawn in Brett Yormark's scheme to destabilize yet another Power 5 conference? Let me know in the comments below.